Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my channel? Thank you so much. Turn the car around now. The words came out of my mouth with such force that my husband nearly swerved off the highway. We were somewhere in upstate New York, maybe an hour from the Canadian border, when every instinct in my body started screaming that something was terribly wrong. "Ruth, what's happening?" my husband asked, already pulling over to the shoulder as cars whooshed past us. My hands were shaking as I stared at the innocent-looking overnight bag sitting in our back seat. Just minutes before, my son Brandon had called me, his voice strangely sweet, asking about that exact bag. The way he said, "I love you," before hanging up. In 42 years, that boy had maybe said those words to me a handful of times, and never ever during a casual phone call. "Something's not right," I whispered, my heart pounding. "We need to turn around right now." My husband looked at me with the same trust he had shown for our 50 years of marriage. He didn't ask questions. He didn't argue. He just waited for a break in traffic and made a U-turn that probably saved both our lives. You see, what I discovered in that bag changed everything I thought I knew about my own son and the family I'd been supporting for years. What they had planned for me, what they were willing to sacrifice to solve their money problems. It was so devastating, so unthinkable, that even now, months later, I can barely believe my own child would put me in such danger. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how we ended up on that highway with me shouting at my husband to turn around before we crossed an international border, I need to tell you about the 5 years leading up to that moment. 5 years of generosity, sacrifice, and love that my son's family had taken completely for granted. Because, you see, I'd been helping them financially ever since Brandon lost his job. Month after month, year after year, I'd been their safety net, their solution to every crisis. And they repaid that kindness by planning something so shocking, so criminal, that it could have destroyed my entire life. Let me start from the beginning, and you'll understand exactly why those 3 words, "turn the car around," were the most important I've ever spoken. Before we dive deeper into Ruth's story, please leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. My name is Ruth Henderson. I'm 68 years old, and I live with my husband of 50 years in our cozy 3-bedroom home in Albany, New York. We raised 3 children in this house. After decades of working as a school secretary, I retired with a modest pension and some savings that we'd carefully built up over the years. Life was good, peaceful, even until 5 years ago when everything changed for our son Brandon's family. Brandon had been working as a warehouse supervisor for nearly 15 years when the company suddenly downsized. Just like that, at 42 years old, he found himself out of work with a wife, Amber, and their 3-year-old son to support. The job market was brutal. Even when Brandon did find work, it was always temporary positions that paid far less than what he'd been making. As his mother, how could I just stand by and watch my son's family struggle? It started small. A couple hundred here and there to help with groceries when things got tight, gas money so Brandon could keep looking for work. Then their landlord raised the rent, and they couldn't make the difference. What was I supposed to do? Let my grandson get evicted? Before I knew it, I was covering most of their major expenses every month: their rent, car payments, insurance, utilities. I was even buying all the groceries and paying for my grandson's daycare so Amber could work her part-time job at a nail salon. "Mom, I promise this is just temporary," Brandon would say whenever I handed him another check. "As soon as I get back on my feet, I'll pay you back every penny." Amber would nod along, though I noticed she never seemed quite as grateful as Brandon. Sometimes I'd catch her rolling her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking or making little comments about how some people have it easier than others. But I pushed those feelings aside because family helps family, right? Oh, how I loved spending time with my grandson. I was babysitting him almost every weekend, taking him to the park, reading him stories, spoiling him the way grandmothers are supposed to do. Those moments made every sacrifice worth it. My husband would sometimes worry that we were giving too much. "Ruth, honey, we need to be careful about our own retirement," he'd say gently. But I couldn't bear the thought of my grandson going without. Besides, we were managing just fine on our pension and Social Security. The years blended together like that. Brandon would find a job, lose a job, find another one that didn't pay enough. I kept writing checks, kept covering their shortfalls, kept being the reliable safety net that held their whole lives together. By the time my grandson started school, I realized I'd been supporting them for almost 5 years straight. Not occasionally, not just in emergencies, but consistently month after month. They'd never had to worry about making ends meet because Grandma Ruth was always there to fill in the gaps. I thought I was being a loving mother and grandmother. I thought I was helping them get through a rough patch until they could stand on their own feet again. What I didn't realize was that somewhere along the way, my generosity had stopped feeling like a gift to them and had started feeling like an obligation. They'd gotten so used to my support that they began to expect it, to plan their lives around it, to see my money as their money. And when I finally, for the first time in 5 years, said no to one of their requests, well, that's when I discovered just how much my own family truly valued me beyond my bank account. Last January, everything changed with one phone call. My grandson had been attending the local public elementary school, and by all accounts, he was doing well academically. But Amber got on the phone and painted a completely different picture. "Ruth, he's being bullied constantly," she said with dramatic concern. "These kids are so cruel, making fun of his clothes, excluding him from everything. The teachers don't care, and the class sizes are huge. He comes home crying almost every day." My heart immediately went out to my grandson. What grandmother wouldn't be devastated hearing that her precious grandchild was suffering? "There's this wonderful private academy across town," Brandon jumped back in. "Small classes, excellent anti-bullying policies, really individual attention for each student. It would solve all his problems." "That sounds perfect," I said, already imagining my grandson thriving in a better environment. "What do you need me to do?" "Well," Amber's voice got a little softer, "the tuition is pretty steep. It's about $15,000 for the remainder of this school term, and then it goes up to $18,000 annually after that." My stomach dropped. Those numbers were enormous compared to anything they'd ever asked for before. But then I thought about my grandson's tearful little face, and I almost said yes right there on the spot. Almost. "Let me think about this," I heard myself saying. "That's quite a bit more than our usual assistance." There was silence on the other end. I could practically feel their surprise through the phone. "Mom," my son said slowly, "this is about your grandson's happiness and future. Surely that's worth any amount of dollars." For 3 days I wrestled with the decision. My husband and I talked it through countless times. We looked at our budget, our retirement plans, our own financial security. The truth was, we could afford it, but it would mean significant changes to our lifestyle and future planning. But something else was bothering me too. In all the times I'd babysat my grandson recently, he'd seemed perfectly happy, chatty about his friends, excited about school projects, never mentioning bullying or problems. When I gently asked him about school, he just shrugged and said it was fine, and went back to playing. Finally, I called them back. "I've thought about this carefully," I told Brandon and Amber. "I love our boy more than anything, but I think we should explore other options first. Maybe we could meet with his teachers or look into the school's anti-bullying programs, or even consider a different public school before jumping to private education." The silence that followed was ice cold. "So you're saying no?" Amber said flatly. "I'm saying let's try other solutions first before committing to such a large expense," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable. "Unbelievable," I heard her mutter to Brandon, though she clearly meant for me to hear it. Some grandmother. The phone call ended shortly after that, with promises to look into other options that I could tell they had no intention of pursuing. Within a week, everything changed. Suddenly, my weekend babysitting sessions were canceled. "We're busy this weekend," became the standard response when I'd call to ask about seeing my grandson. Family dinners at their house, which had been a monthly tradition, stopped being mentioned. When I'd call just to chat with my grandson, the conversations became awkward and rushed. "He's doing homework," or "he's playing with friends," or "it's not a good time," became Amber's usual responses. The worst part was running into them at the grocery store one afternoon. My grandson saw me and ran over with the biggest smile, throwing his little arms around my waist for a hug. But when Amber noticed, she quickly called him back with a sharp, "Come on, we need to go," and barely acknowledged my presence. My own grandson looked confused by his mother's cold behavior toward me. I could see it in his innocent little face. He didn't understand why Grandma Ruth suddenly wasn't welcome in their lives. For the first time in decades of providing assistance, I'd set one boundary, asked for one pause to consider alternatives, and this was their response. The message was crystal clear. My value to them was purely financial. The grandmother who had covered their expenses, watched their child, and been their safety net for half a decade, was being punished for daring to say, "Let's think about this," instead of immediately writing a check. 2 months went by like this. 2 months of being shut out, of missing my grandson terribly, of wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. I started to question myself. I started thinking maybe I should just pay the tuition and get my loved ones back. That's exactly when they called with their sudden change of heart and the invitation that would lead us to that highway in upstate New York. Looking back now, I realized those 2 months of cold treatment weren't punishment for saying no. They were preparation for something much worse. Then, just as suddenly as the freeze had begun, it ended. It was early April when my phone rang, and I heard my son's voice sounding more cheerful than it had in months. "Hey, Mom, how are you and Dad doing?" he asked with an enthusiasm that immediately caught my attention. After 2 months of barely speaking to us, this dramatic shift felt almost jarring. "We're fine, dear," I said cautiously. "How's everyone there?" "Great, actually, that's why I'm calling. Amber and I have been talking, and we realized we've been way too stressed about everything lately. We thought maybe it would be good for all of us to get away together, spend some quality time as relatives." My heart leapt. Despite everything that had happened, I'd missed them terribly, especially my grandson. Amber's cousin has this beautiful cabin up in Quebec, right by a lake. She invited us all to come up for a long weekend. You, Dad, me, Amber, and our boy. What do you think? The idea of a trip together, of getting my loved ones back, was exactly what I'd been hoping for. Maybe they'd finally realized that our relationship was more important than disagreements about educational expenses. "That sounds wonderful," I told him. "When were you thinking?" "This coming weekend, actually. I know it's short notice, but Amber's cousin just had a cancellation, and the weather's supposed to be perfect. It would be such a great opportunity for our boy to see his grandparents and for all of us to reconnect." We made plans for them to drive up with us. My husband and I had a comfortable SUV that could fit everyone. They mentioned something about bringing fishing gear and games for our grandson. "Oh, and Mom," Brandon added as we were finishing up the call, "would you mind carrying one extra bag for us? Your car is packed pretty tight with all the kids' stuff and fishing equipment. It's just a small overnight bag." "Of course, sweetheart," I said without hesitation. What grandmother wouldn't help carry an extra bag? The night before we left, Amber dropped off the bag at our house. It was a standard black overnight bag. Nothing unusual about it. She was actually quite pleasant, chatting about how excited our grandson was for the trip and thanking us for agreeing to help with transportation. "He's been talking about seeing Grandma and Grandpa all week," she said with a smile that seemed genuine. "This trip is going to be so good for all of us." I went to bed that night feeling hopeful for the first time in months. The next morning, we decided to take 2 cars since there was so much luggage, fishing equipment, and supplies for the weekend. My husband and I took our SUV with the overnight bag and some of the gear, while Brandon drove their car with Amber and my grandson following behind us. The drive started out perfectly. Our grandson kept waving at us from their car, and we'd pull alongside at red lights so he could show us his travel games and snacks. It felt like old times, like we were a close-knit unit again. We'd been driving for about 3 hours, making good time toward the Canadian border when my phone rang. It was Brandon calling from their car behind us. "Mom, hey, quick question," he said, and something in his tone immediately put me on edge. There was a nervous quality to his voice that I'd never heard before. "Yeah, honey. That bag Amber gave you, you've got it with you, right? It made it into the car?" "Yes, of course. It's right here next to me." "Good, good. And you haven't? I mean, you didn't need to move anything around in it or anything, right?" The question was odd. Why would I be going through their personal bag? "No, sweetheart. I haven't touched it." "Why?" "Oh, no reason. Just making sure everything's secure for the border crossing. You know how careful they are these days." He paused and then said something that sent chills down my spine. "I love you, Mom. You know that, right? I really, really love you." My son had never in his entire adult life called me just to tell me he loved me. Never. And certainly never with that intensity, that almost desperate tone. I hung up the phone, but my hands were trembling. Every maternal instinct I developed over nearly 7 decades was suddenly screaming at me that something was terribly wrong. "Turn the car around now." That's when I shouted those words to my husband, the words that probably saved both our lives. We pulled over at the next exit, and while my husband kept everyone distracted, I quietly opened that innocent-looking overnight bag. What I found inside made my blood run cold. Carefully hidden beneath my grandson's folded pajamas and some of his favorite toys were small packages wrapped in plastic. Even at my age, I wasn't naive enough not to recognize what I was looking at: drugs, a significant amount of them. My own son and his wife had planned to use me as an unwitting drug smuggler across an international border. They'd counted on my love for my grandson, my desire to reconnect with relatives, and my complete trust in them to carry their illegal cargo without question. If we'd been caught at that border, and with the way they were checking cars that day, we very well might have been. I would have been the one facing criminal charges. At 68, I would have been looking at years in prison for drug trafficking. And Brandon's phone call, that wasn't checking on the bag. That was him getting emotional because he knew he was about to destroy his mother's life to solve his own problems. The worst part was realizing that this entire reunion trip had been planned from the moment I'd said no to that tuition. The cold treatment, the sudden reconciliation, the urgent timeline, the cousin's cabin. All of it had been a carefully orchestrated plan to manipulate my love for them into committing a federal crime. As I stared at those packages hidden among my grandson's innocent belongings, I realized that my own child was willing to sacrifice everything: my freedom, my reputation, my entire future, rather than learn to live within his means or find legal solutions to his financial troubles. That was the moment I understood that the Ruth who had spent half a decade enabling and supporting them was gone forever. Standing there on that highway shoulder, staring at those packages hidden beneath my grandson's innocent pajamas, I felt something shift inside me permanently. The Ruth who had spent half a decade making excuses for her son's poor choices was gone. The grandmother who had prioritized keeping peace over protecting herself had vanished in that moment of terrible clarity. My husband walked over quietly. "What did you find, honey?" I showed him the contents without saying a word. His face went white, then hard with an anger I'd rarely seen in our 5 decades of marriage. "We're going home," he said simply. "Right now." From their car behind us, I could see Brandon getting agitated, probably wondering why we'd stopped. My phone started ringing again, but I turned it off. I couldn't bear to hear his voice, knowing what he'd planned to do to me. The drive back to Albany was silent between my husband and me, but my mind was racing. Every moment of the past 2 months suddenly made perfect sense. The cold treatment after I'd refused the tuition wasn't punishment. It was preparation. They'd needed to create distance so that when they suddenly invited me on this trip, I'd be so grateful for the reconciliation that I wouldn't ask questions. They'd manipulated my love for my grandson, my desperation to repair our relationship, and my complete trust in them to nearly destroy my life. When we pulled into their driveway, Brandon and Amber were already out of their car, looking confused and increasingly panicked. "Mom, what's going on?" my son called out as I walked toward their front door with the overnight bag. Why did we turn around? We were almost there. I set the bag down on their doorstep and looked at my son. I really looked at him. When had he become someone I didn't recognize? When had his struggles turned him into a person willing to sacrifice his mother's freedom for his own convenience? "I know what's in the bag," I said quietly. The color drained from both their faces. Amber grabbed my son's arm, and I could see them exchanging panicked glances. "Mom, I can explain," Brandon started. "No," I cut him off, my voice steady despite my trembling hands. "There's nothing to explain. You planned to use me to commit a federal crime. You were willing to let me face prison time to solve your financial problems." "It wasn't like that," Amber burst out. "We were desperate. We owe people significant amounts, and they were threatening us. We thought if we could just make one trip." "You thought you could sacrifice me instead of dealing with your own choices," I finished for her. My grandson was standing behind them, looking confused and scared by the adult's strange behavior. My heart broke for him, caught in the middle of his parents' terrible decisions. "I want you to listen to me very carefully," I continued, my voice growing stronger. "I will no longer be providing any financial assistance to your household. No rent help. No car payments, no groceries, no emergency funds, nothing. Mom, you can't be serious, Brandon said, desperation creeping into his voice. We depend on that support. We can't survive without it. Then you'll need to figure out how to survive, won't you? I replied. The same way millions of other adults manage their finances without putting their mothers at risk for federal drug charges. I turned to walk back to our car. But Brandon grabbed my arm. Please just think about this. We made a mistake, but if you cut us off now, we'll lose everything. The house, the cars, everything. I gently pulled my arm free and looked at him one last time. You were willing to let me lose everything. My freedom, my reputation, my entire future. Now you'll have to face the consequences of your own choices. As we drove away, I could see them in my rearview mirror standing in their driveway holding that bag, probably realizing for the first time that their financial safety net was gone forever. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and made a list of every automatic payment, every monthly check, every form of assistance I'd been providing. The total was staggering. I'd been essentially subsidizing their entire lifestyle for so long that I'd forgotten what our own budget looked like without those expenses. Within a week, I'd canceled every form of support, the bank accounts they had access to for emergencies, the credit card I'd given them for groceries, the automatic payments for their car insurance, all of it gone. I also did something else that night. I called a lawyer and described what had happened, asking what legal steps I should take to protect myself. He was horrified by their plan and helped me document everything in case they ever tried to claim I'd been involved willingly. For the first time in decades, I was putting my own safety and well-being ahead of my son's convenience. It should have felt selfish, but instead, it felt like the most responsible thing I'd ever done. Because the truth was, by enabling their poor choices for so long, I hadn't been helping them. I'd been preventing them from learning to solve their own problems, to live within their means, to make adult decisions about their lives. And now, finally, they would have to. 4 weeks after I cut them off, reality hit them hard. My phone started ringing constantly. First it was Brandon, then Amber, sometimes even using my grandson's phone to try to guilt me into answering. Let every call go to voicemail. The messages started out angry. Mom, our credit cards are being declined everywhere. You can't just abandon us like this. Then they became desperate. Please, we're about to lose the house. Just help us one more time and we'll figure something else out. But I'd heard those promises before for 5 long decades. This time I stayed strong. Then came the call from my daughter-in-law's sister, whom I barely knew. Ruth, I think you should know that Amber and Brandon are planning to try that Canada trip again, she said quietly. But this time they're planning to go themselves. They're desperate, and I'm worried they're going to do something stupid. My blood ran cold. Even after everything that had happened, they were still planning to traffic drugs rather than find legal solutions to their debt problems. When I asked this weekend, they asked me to watch their son. They said they were going on a business trip for a couple of days. I immediately called my lawyer. He advised me to contact the authorities with this information, but I couldn't, even after what they tried to do to me. That Saturday morning, I was drinking coffee in my kitchen when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. Is this Ruth Henderson? A woman's voice asked. Yes, this is Officer Martinez with U.S. Border Patrol. Your son Brandon Henderson and daughter-in-law Amber Henderson were arrested early this morning attempting to cross into Canada with illegal substances. They listed you as their emergency contact. My hands started shaking, but not from shock. I'd known this call was coming. Where is their son? I managed to say. He's currently with a family member, but Child Protective Services needs to arrange proper placement since you're listed as next of kin. Within hours, I was filling out emergency custody paperwork. My grandson, confused and scared, came home with me that afternoon, carrying a small suitcase and his favorite stuffed animal. Grandma Ruth, he asked that first night as I tucked him into the guest bedroom that would become his room. When are Mom and Dad coming back? How do you explain to an 8-year-old that his parents chose to risk everything, including him, rather than learn to live responsibly? They made some bad choices, sweetheart, I told him gently. But you're safe here with Grandpa and me, and we're going to take very good care of you. Over the following months, the legal process unfolded exactly as I'd expected. Brandon and Amber were sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. The house they couldn't afford without my assistance went into foreclosure. Their cars were repossessed. But you know what? I felt no satisfaction in their downfall, only sadness that it had come to this and relief that my grandson was safe. The custody hearing was surprisingly straightforward. Brandon and Amber, facing significant prison time, agreed to sign temporary custody to me rather than risk their son going into the foster care system. My lawyer helped us establish a clear arrangement that protected everyone's interests. My grandson started at a new school near our house, the same excellent public school where I'd once worked as a secretary. The teachers there remembered me fondly and went out of their way to help him adjust. No expensive private academy was needed, just caring adults and a stable environment. In the evenings, he'd do his homework at my kitchen table while I prepared dinner. My husband taught him to play chess and helped him with math. We read stories together every night, the same way I'd done with Brandon when he was small. Slowly, my grandson's confusion faded and was replaced with a sense of security he'd never really had before. No more parents fighting about finances. No more uncertainty about whether bills would be paid. No more adults making desperate choices that put everyone at risk. "Grandma," he said to me one day about 6 months after he'd come to live with us, "I like it here. It's quiet." That's when I realized what we'd all been missing. Peace. Simple. Ordinary peace that comes from living within your means, making responsible choices, and putting the well-being of children first. As for Brandon and Amber, they write occasional letters from prison. Brandon's letters are full of apologies and promises to do better when he gets out. Amber's are mostly complaints about prison conditions and reminders that I owe them for all the difficulties they're facing. I don't respond to either of them. My lawyer has advised me that when they're released, they'll likely seek to regain custody of their son. We're already preparing for that legal battle, documenting the stable home environment we've provided and the educational progress my grandson has made. But for now, our days are filled with school projects, weekend fishing trips with my husband, and quiet evenings reading together on the couch. My grandson is thriving in ways I never saw when he was caught in the chaos of his parents' financial irresponsibility. And me, I've learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, especially when it's coming from your own child. I'm 73 now, and I have no idea how many more decades I have left. But I know I'll spend whatever time I have raising my grandson to be the kind of man who solves problems honestly, treats people with respect, and never ever asks someone else to pay the price for his mistakes. That's my story. That's how a grandmother's protective instincts and willingness to set boundaries saved not just her own life, but gave her grandson the stable childhood his parents couldn't provide. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say to people who take advantage of your generosity isn't, "I'll help you one more time." Sometimes it's, "I love you too much to keep enabling you." And sometimes that's exactly what the next generation needs to hear. So that's my story. I'd love to hear what you think. Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with family members who were taking advantage of your generosity? Let me know in the comments and subscribe for more stories like mine.